In my whole career, I've never seen anything like this.
Lady Louise Windsor had spent years doing almost everything expected of her, staying quiet, avoiding spectacle, and allowing louder members of the royal family to dominate the headlines. Then came one sentence nobody around her was prepared to hear. It was not diplomatic. It was not carefully softened. And most dangerously, it was personal. Louise drew a line around her own family and placed Queen Camilla firmly on the other side of it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Louise had grown up differently from many royals closest to the throne. Lady Louise Windsor, the daughter of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had been raised with comparatively less public drama and fewer expectations of constant visibility. That mattered because her reputation was built on restraint. She did not usually create confrontation. She avoided becoming the story. So when she finally spoke during a tense private family discussion, everyone understood that this was not casual frustration. Louise looked toward her parents and said it plainly. Camilla will never be welcome at our family table. The Queen's private place within gatherings centered around Edward, Sophie, Louise, and James was suddenly being rejected. A family table, in this context, meant their personal circle rather than any constitutional or ceremonial royal role. Louise was not challenging the crown. She was challenging intimacy. Sophie froze. The trusted confidant understood immediately that her daughter had crossed beyond irritation into something much deeper. Louise was defining who belonged inside her emotional idea of family and who did not. Edward reacted more slowly. Prince Edward lowered the cup in his hand and asked whether she truly understood what she had just said. Louise did not retreat. She told him she would not pretend private affection existed where she believed trust had disappeared. Edward studied her expression, waiting for anger to soften the statement, but none came. Sophie saw the same thing. That composure was what frightened them most. The silence grew heavier because Louise had clearly thought about this before speaking. There was no burst of temper to blame, and no single careless phrase to excuse. She had reached a conclusion. Sophie understood the deeper distinction before anyone else said it aloud. Louise was not demanding that Camilla lose her title, her public duties, or her place beside Charles. The Queen Consort could remain exactly where the monarchy placed her. But Louise was drawing a boundary between the institution and the family's private life. And behind those 12 devastating words was something nobody in the room could ignore anymore. A chain of private hurts, one particular incident, and the moment Louise decided Camilla had crossed a line she would never forget. To understand that decision, the story has to move away from the Queen and toward the people Louise believed she was protecting. For Louise, this was never supposed to become a battle over crowns. It was about something far smaller, and therefore far more painful: loyalty inside a family. Between Sophie's instinct to preserve peace, Edward's lifelong habit of remaining dependable, and Louise's growing belief that silence had begun to cost them too much, 3 members of one household were suddenly forced to decide whether royal harmony mattered more than private dignity. Edward had spent most of his adult life occupying a quieter royal lane. Prince Edward, the late Queen Elizabeth II's youngest son, built his place around service rather than dominance, while Sophie became one of the monarchy's most dependable working figures. A working royal is a family member who carries out official duties on behalf of the crown, and that distinction mattered because their household had rarely been built around spectacle. Louise grew up watching both parents contribute without demanding the attention commanded by Charles, William, or the most central figures. Louise absorbed that example deeply. Lady Louise Windsor had learned that loyalty did not always need applause, but she had also begun to see how easily restraint could be mistaken for weakness. Her frustration was not that her parents lacked influence. It was that their willingness to avoid confrontation sometimes seemed to make other people assume they would accept anything quietly. Sophie felt the conflict more sharply than anyone. The trusted confidant did not want her daughter pulled into hostility involving Camilla, yet she could hear that Louise's words came from somewhere deeper than temper. Later, mother and daughter sat alone with no aides present. Sophie asked only one question. Is this anger, or is this your decision? Louise answered without hesitation. Anger passes, she said. What she felt now was certainty. Edward worried about what certainty could become once it left the room. The Duke understood that a private boundary involving the Queen could be interpreted as a royal split the moment someone else repeated it. He asked Louise whether she was speaking for the household. She immediately said no. The statement belonged to her alone. Louise insisted that neither Sophie nor Edward had instructed her, encouraged her, or asked her to confront anyone. She was taking ownership precisely because she did not want her parents accused of hiding behind their daughter. Sophie understood the courage in that choice, even if she feared its consequences. But one detail refused to leave her mind. Louise could name the exact moment her trust had changed. One family gathering. One uncomfortable exchange. One conversation that had turned unease into something permanent. The explosion had happened now, but the fuse had been lit much earlier across another family table, where Camilla said something Louise could never forget. Every family fracture has a moment that looks ordinary, until everyone begins remembering it afterward. In this dramatized story, Louise's came during a private Windsor dinner months earlier. Nothing shattered. Nobody stormed out. There was no public argument. That was precisely why it mattered. A seating discussion, a restrained exchange between Sophie and Camilla, and one response Louise could not forget, quietly altered the atmosphere. By the time dessert arrived, something inside her relationship with the Queen had already changed. Charles had gathered Camilla, Edward, Sophie, and Louise for what was meant to be a private family meal rather than a formal state occasion. Royal precedence, meaning the traditional order that determines who ranks ahead of whom at official events, should not have mattered much in such a setting. Edward kept the conversation light, while Sophie tried to preserve warmth, despite the small tensions already forming around where everyone would sit. Camilla changed the mood with one objection. The Queen Consort challenged Sophie's preferred seating arrangement and insisted that senior royal precedents still be respected, even at an informal dinner. Sophie did not argue. The trusted confidant simply picked up her place card and moved it to the position Camilla preferred. Louise watched the entire exchange. Lady Louise Windsor noticed the brief expression on her mother's face before Sophie recovered and smiled as though nothing had happened. To everyone else, it was etiquette. To Louise, it felt like humiliation disguised as order. The chair was not the problem. The ease with which her mother had been expected to move was. Edward tried to calm her afterward. Prince Edward told his daughter not to interpret every formal instinct as a personal attack, reminding her that habits formed inside royal life could appear colder than they were intended to be. Louise listened because she respected her father. But she could not forget that Sophie had once again been the person expected to absorb the discomfort quietly. Louise finally spoke to her mother later that evening. She told Sophie that the issue was never the place card. It was that everyone in the room seemed to know who would be easiest to ask to move. The trusted confidant tried to soften the memory, but her daughter had already attached a deeper meaning to it. That moment stayed buried for months. Louise did not confront Camilla. She did not complain publicly, she simply remembered. And then another encounter brought the feeling back, with far greater force. Louise had swallowed the first insult as she understood it. The next time the tension surfaced, there would be no place card to move, and no silence left to protect. When Louise finally stood opposite Camilla, the confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with politeness, and somehow that made it worse. The Queen expected an uncomfortable discussion that could still be contained by manners. Louise arrived with something else entirely. She had already decided that respect for royal position did not require emotional closeness, and within minutes, the difference between those two ideas became painfully impossible to ignore. Camilla had asked for the conversation herself after learning that Louise's statement was circulating inside the family. The Queen Consort wanted to avoid intermediaries, meaning other people carrying messages between two sides instead of allowing them to speak directly. Sophie worried the meeting would deepen the fracture. but the trusted confidant respected her daughter's insistence on answering for herself. Edward remained nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but he did not enter the room. Camilla went straight to the question neither of them could avoid. She asked Louise whether she genuinely intended to exclude her from private family gatherings. Lady Louise Windsor looked directly at her and answered without raising her voice. Courtesy, she said, would always be given. Respect for public position would remain. But intimacy could not be commanded. Camilla heard the deeper rejection immediately. The Queen was not simply being denied a chair at a table. She was being told that rank could guarantee formal respect, but not emotional acceptance. That distinction struck at a vulnerability no protocol could repair. Camilla asked whether Sophie had encouraged the decision, and Louise answered before the accusation could grow. No, her mother had not instructed her, supported an attack, or asked her to draw the boundary. Louise then named the moment everything had changed. She brought up the Windsor dinner and described watching Sophie quietly move her place card while everyone else continued eating. Camilla tried to explain that the decision had been about precedence, not humiliation. Royal precedence meant the traditional ranking system used to determine order at formal events. Louise replied that the dinner was supposed to be private, and that was precisely why the moment had hurt. Camilla insisted she had never intended to diminish Sophie. Louise accepted that intent might have been different from impact, but she also said something harsher. Maintaining peace had begun to look too much like asking the same people to absorb every slight without complaint. Camilla left shaken. Louise had not challenged her title. She had challenged the assumption that a title could force belonging. And now the dispute moved into even more dangerous territory. Could Charles, William, or anyone else compel a private family to reopen a door Louise had deliberately closed? A palace can organize precedents, titles, ceremonies, carriages, and invitations. What it cannot manufacture is affection. That uncomfortable distinction becomes the center of the crisis when Charles learns that Louise's declaration cannot simply be treated like an error in protocol. Camilla may be queen, but the disputed table is not a state banquet. It belongs to the private world of Edward and Sophie, and in that world, royal rank suddenly becomes surprisingly powerless. Charles heard the full account in private and immediately understood the problem. The king could control formal crown occasions, meaning official events carried out on behalf of the monarchy, but he could not dictate every invitation inside another household's personal life. A state banquet followed rank and ceremony. Edward and Sophie's private family table did not. That difference mattered because Camilla's public position gave her authority inside the institution, not automatic emotional access everywhere beyond it. Charles rubbed a hand across his forehead before answering. The monarch was not simply defending a queen. He was facing the painful possibility that members of his own family did not see Camilla as belonging inside their closest private circle. That realization cut deeper than any disagreement over etiquette. Edward tried to keep his voice measured. Prince Edward told his brother he wanted no escalation and no public spectacle. But he also refused to order Louise into an apology she did not mean. His daughter had drawn the boundary herself, and forcing her to withdraw it would only replace one form of tension with another. Charles pressed him with the question neither brother wanted to answer. What would happen if Camilla arrived anyway? Edward hesitated. The silence lasted long enough to show how serious the answer would be. Then he said quietly, "I would never humiliate her at the door, but I would ask that the boundary be respected." Charles sat with that sentence. The king realized there was no comfortable exercise of power available. If he commanded an invitation, he would turn Louise's personal decision into a battle between royal households. If he refused to interfere, Camilla would understand that even his authority had limits where private belonging was concerned. Edward made one final point. He was not asking Charles to choose between his wife and his brother. He was asking him to recognize that affection could not be ordered like protocol. The monarch knew he was right, even if accepting it felt brutal. Charles chose restraint. He would not command an invitation. He would not force an apology. But when that decision reached Camilla, She did not hear restraint. The queen consort heard something colder, confirmation that the king could not, or would not make the family open the door for her. The loudest rejection was Louise's statement. The most painful moment for Camilla came afterward, when nobody reversed it. No command arrived. No forced apology followed. No carefully engineered family photograph erased the fracture. Instead, the palace returned to routine, while one private truth remained untouched. There was now a family space, where the queen's title could not guarantee her presence. And for the first time, the silence surrounding her carried its own verdict. Camilla received Charles's decision privately. The queen consort learned that Edward's household would not be pressured, and that Louise would not be ordered into an apology she did not mean. Around them, palace staff continued preparing normal engagements, briefing schedules, and official duties. A royal engagement meant a public duty carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and those obligations continued as though nothing had changed. That contrast made the personal fracture feel even harsher. The institution remained stable, while the family underneath it strained. Camilla sat with a cup of tea untouched beside her, as Charles explained why he had chosen restraint. The king told her that forcing Edward to invite her, or compelling Louise to withdraw her words, would only turn a painful private boundary into a larger royal confrontation. Camilla listened without interrupting. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Then Camilla asked the question she had been holding back. Did Edward actually say she could keep me out? The queen looked directly at Charles, waiting for something firmer than careful reasoning. He answered that the issue was not whether Edward had granted permission. It was whether anyone could compel a private invitation without destroying the very relationship they were trying to preserve. Camilla heard abandonment in that answer. Charles believed he was protecting her from a more humiliating conflict, but the queen consort heard something colder. Even her husband would not force the door open. The king tried to explain that restraint was not surrender. She replied that it felt remarkably similar when the result remained exactly the same. The silence between them hardened. Camilla began to understand why Louise's declaration was gaining power. Nobody was punishing her for it. Nobody was forcing her to retract it. What had started as one young woman's private boundary was becoming symbolic of a deeper question inside the blended royal family. Could public acceptance ever guarantee private belonging? Charles had no answer that could repair that wound. The king could defend her title. He could protect her official standing. He could not command affection. For a moment, the situation seemed frozen completely. Then an unexpected conversation was proposed, not between Camilla and Louise, but between Louise and the one person who could challenge her without using rank. The palace had failed to order reconciliation. Whatever happened next would have to come without titles, advisors, or royal machinery in the room. After days of tension, Sophie does something the palace cannot. She speaks to Louise not as a duchess managing a crisis, but simply as her mother. There are no aides, no briefings, and no discussion of how the story might look outside the family. Sophie wants to know whether her daughter is protecting her or using her pain to justify something harsher. Louise's answer becomes the turning point, because, for the first time, anger finally gives way to honesty. Sophie waits until the immediate confrontation has cooled before asking Louise to sit with her alone. The Duchess of Edinburgh is a senior working royal, but none of that matters in this room. She is only a mother trying to understand what her daughter has become willing to carry. Sophie admits that the Windsor dinner hurt her. She also makes something equally clear. She never asked Louise to inherit that hurt or turn it into a permanent judgment against Camilla. Sophie reaches across the table and takes her daughter's hand. The trusted confidant tells Louise she does not want love for her to become a reason for bitterness. For the first time since the declaration, Louise looks down instead of answering immediately. Lady Louise Windsor admits that this may be exactly what happened. Watching her mother absorb humiliation so quietly had made her furious, and that fury had slowly hardened into certainty. Louise does not withdraw the boundary. She tells Sophie that she still refuses to pretend closeness exists where trust has been damaged. But she also draws a new distinction. Refusing Camilla a place at the family table today is not the same as deciding the Queen can never again be treated as a human being rather than a symbol of rank. That difference matters because it leaves room for change without demanding false affection. Sophie hears the shift immediately. She asks the question nobody else has dared to ask. If Camilla approached privately, without demanding an invitation, without insisting on an apology, and without using Charles or royal position as leverage, would Louise speak to her again? Louise takes several seconds before answering. Yes. The word is small, but it changes the entire crisis. The table remains closed for now. Louise has not surrendered her boundary, and Sophie does not ask her to. But the emotional door is no longer being nailed shut purely by anger. For the first time, mother and daughter leave the conversation with something other than tension between them. Sophie knows Louise is still hurt. Louise knows her mother does not need to be defended through permanent hostility. Inside that room, the temperature finally falls. Outside it, those 12 words are already escaping, and the public is about to turn one private family boundary into a national argument over what it means to belong to the House of Windsor. By the time Louise begins reconsidering the anger behind her words, the public is only beginning to hear them. The sentence escapes its private setting and becomes irresistible precisely because it sounds so unroyal. Camilla will never be welcome at our family table. Suddenly, Britain is no longer discussing precedents or constitutional duty. It is discussing mothers, daughters, stepfamilies, resentment and belonging, and an intensely private family boundary becomes the most emotionally accessible royal argument in years. Louise wakes to discover that one sentence has become national shorthand for a much larger fracture. Lady Louise Windsor had intended to describe a private emotional boundary, but television panels and newspapers now treat it as a referendum on whether royal title can ever force personal acceptance. Palace messaging remains restrained. Palace messaging simply means the official language used to shape public understanding of royal events. No statement attacks Louise directly, and nobody describes the disagreement as an institutional crisis. That silence keeps the crown calm, while the family itself remains exposed. The spectacle sharpens when a fictional morning newspaper appears beneath one enormous headline, "Not at our table." Louise's words sit between contrasting portraits of her and Camilla, turning a complicated family history into something brutally simple. The young royal sees the front page over breakfast and loses the composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation. Her first emotion is not satisfaction. It is horror that Sophie has now been dragged into a public story Louise had insisted was hers alone. Sophie realizes immediately what her daughter is feeling. The trusted confidant tells Louise that she does not need to defend her again, especially not through another statement that might feed the cycle. Louise admits that she never imagined one private sentence would become a weapon for strangers arguing about her mother. The pain of seeing Sophie pulled into the spectacle makes victory feel strangely empty. Camilla absorbs the coverage from the other side. The Queen Consort hears a broadcaster describe the dispute as a crisis of belonging rather than rank. The phrase lands heavily because it captures exactly what she feared. Her title is not under attack. Something harder to defend is whether people closest to the monarchy emotionally accept her at all. Charles receives proposals for a staged public appearance that could suggest family unity. The king rejects them. He refuses to manufacture smiles simply to erase a headline, knowing a false display would humiliate Louise, Camilla, and Sophie in different ways. The public wants a winner and a loser. Charles finally decides the family will provide neither. Instead, they choose something less theatrical and more difficult. No forced apology, no staged reconciliation, and no pretend affection. And that choice leaves Louise facing the final question: what does her boundary mean once anger is no longer the thing holding it in place? In the end, nobody is expelled from the monarchy. No title changes hands. No constitutional crisis follows. The consequence is quieter than that and more human. Louise refuses to apologize for drawing a private boundary, but she also refuses to let resentment become her permanent identity. Camilla receives no forced invitation, yet neither is she condemned to endless hostility. And Charles finally understands the distinction everyone had spent days avoiding. Acceptance demanded by rank is not acceptance at all. Charles makes the final decision without ceremony. The king will not interfere in Edward and Sophie's private hospitality, while every formal royal obligation continues exactly as required. Formal royal obligations are the official duties and appearances members of the family carry out on behalf of the crown, and separating those duties from private relationships becomes the key to ending the crisis. Edward supports that line because it prevents one painful family dispute from becoming an institutional war. Sophie adds something even more important. The trusted confidant insists that any future contact between Louise and Camilla must come through honest conversation, not staged photographs or carefully arranged displays of unity. She refuses to let appearances become a substitute for trust. Edward agrees. Their household will remain open to change, but not to pressure. Louise meets Camilla once more in private. Lady Louise Windsor does not withdraw the hurt behind her original statement, but she does acknowledge something difficult. The words, "never welcome," came from a place of anger. She no longer wants controlling the future. The queen consort listens without interrupting. For the first time, neither woman appears interested in proving the other wrong. Camilla answers with equal restraint. The queen says she will not ask for an invitation. Acceptance, she admits, cannot be demanded. Louise hears the difference immediately. There is no victory in the sentence, and no hidden challenge. It is simply recognition. The boundary remains. Edward and Sophie's family table stays their private space, with invitations determined personally rather than by royal status. Louise's decision is respected, but it does not become a permanent campaign against Camilla. The door is not forced open. It is simply no longer sealed by anger. Charles finally sees the larger truth. The monarch can define hierarchy, titles, precedence, and ceremony. He cannot define intimacy. Camilla understands that becoming queen did not erase every complication of a blended royal family. Louise understands that protecting Sophie does not require carrying bitterness forever. That is the final verdict. Louise's statement matters, not because it humiliates Camilla, but because it exposes the limit of royal power. Titles can decide who walks first through a state doorway. They cannot decide who feels trusted